name is Roy, and welcome back to Sacred Wild Man. Today I'd like to share with you the topic of awakening and being offended. This topic was inspired by Dr. Shefali in her most recent viral wisdom video, number 8. You can find her on Facebook at Dr. Shefali. And in this video, she has a brief moment where she responds to an audience member's question, and I will go ahead and read that question in response to you right now. So the audience member asked, "How can we be authentic without offending other people?" And Dr. Shefali responded, "You can't not offend people who wish to be offended. You see, when we awaken and we decide to be authentic, by that very process, we're going to piss other people off. Because culture has been predicated on fear and control, so the others in our lives are also in fear and control. We have lived in fear and control until we awaken. So when we awaken and we release the shackles of fear and control, we piss everyone else around us off. We offend them, we hurt them, and they feel betrayed. They feel as if we have gone against the holy grail of loyalty. This is only because culture, and they, and we, have been addicted to fear and control. So fear and control are the two things we are liberating ourselves from when we awaken. And when you liberate yourself from fear and control, you then enter who you truly are. Now, when I first heard this, I got really excited because the first thing I began to do was think about all the people in my life who I deemed asleep and how good it felt to me perceiving myself as awake and being able to point the finger at them. And I caught that, and it was a humble reminder that I'm coming from an egoic frame of mind, which is also that of an asleep mind. And so my recommendation to you is to apply that message to yourself. Don't apply it to other people. Look in the mirror at yourself. Because there's a good chance that you are the person who wishes to be offended. That you are the person who is walking around looking for the next opportunity to be offended by somebody else. Why? Well, for me, I enjoyed that feeling when I was more in that victim consciousness state, is because it was empowering. It was much more empowering than where I used to be. Where I used to be was one of being very depressed and despondent. And so the moment anger kicked in, we have different stages of emotions that we move through. Where I was being more depressed, apathetic was a much lower state. So anger and rage was one step above that. And I thought, hey, this feels pretty good to point the finger at other people. It's my parents' fault, it's my friend's fault, it's the bully's fault, it's society's fault, it's the government's fault. Pointing the finger at anybody and everybody. And for a while, that felt very empowering until it didn't. So for me, that decision or that realization came when I realized that all of that rage, this righteous bitterness, was beginning to leave me feeling depressed again. Because there was no movement towards true empowerment. It was just the same repeated tape of me blaming other people, pointing the finger at other people, saying how good they have it and how bad I have it. And once I reached that realization, it was time for me to make a change. I was not willing to stay in a victim consciousness anymore. Now, if you watched my last video on the warrior monk and the path of renunciation for men, you will have caught the part where I mentioned a quote by A.H. Almas in his Glossary of Spiritual Wisdom. And in that quote, he talks about how, in the end, the most painful things that happen to us are actually the most compassionate. So your greatest wounds being your greatest gifts. And I know that may not apply to every person in this current time, being that should make no sense, which was the case for me. When I would have considered that quote 5 years ago, I would have been very angry. And I'd be questioning, how can you assert that the most painful things that happen to me are, in the end, the most compassionate? And the way I connect that to Dr. Shefali and what she brings up with being offended is that when you're offended by somebody, there's an actual opportunity to look deeper into what that is about. So nowadays in Western society, we have all these trigger warnings, we have these super, super safe spaces, all for the sake of protecting people from feeling offended and having their feelings hurt. Now, I think that comes from a good heart, originally, at the base level, being respectful of other people. However, I think it's swung to an extreme end where it is now about controlling what you can or can't say, how you should or shouldn't think, the thought police. And that's taxing and oppressive for everybody. To think that you have to monitor your own thoughts, that you have to police your own thoughts, because if you don't, somebody else will. That's not a healthy place to live for anybody. And we wonder why we're all depressed and anxious. That just being one reason of many. Now, with these triggers, there's an opportunity to look a little bit deeper. The way I see it, and especially coming from my background in psychology and working as a therapist, is that these triggers are actually reflections of wounds. Wounds in our past that were never resolved, whether that was in relation to our parents, family, friends, or bullies, whoever it was. These experiences where we experienced something traumatic, unpleasant, and never had any resolution around it. And so we carry those wounds throughout our lives, and they dictate how we behave, how we think, what beliefs we have in the present day, and that shapes our future. Where you come from determines where you are going. And if you're not conscious of that, you will end up inevitably where you came from, whatever pain that was. So the task that I do for myself and try to encourage in my clients is to be able to accept compassionately those triggers, those wounds. Because when you can look a little bit deeper, you can begin to integrate and heal and love those aspects of yourself that were never loved before. Because if you think of those wounds as abandoned children, they are still stuck in the pain. The adult, the parent, has not come to help them out, and they may never will. And it's either up to us to learn to parent ourselves to heal those wounds, to be the savior that we're looking for, or we can continue to point the finger at other people, point it at romantic partners, saying, hey, you are the one who needs to be the person who rights all the wrongs of my past. You're the one responsible and tasked with giving me pleasure and delight that I never experienced before. That will inevitably leave both of you feeling depressed and bitter. One aspect of awakening that can be very hard for people is that it presents the risk of abandonment. And what I mean by that is the moment you stray away from the status quo, or even just begin to question the status quo, question the culture, you put yourself at risk of being against all the people who agree with the status quo. An example of this is when I was part of a church community. And there came a time where I was having some questions. I was having not so much an existential crisis, but really questioning, hey, why do we believe what we believe? And why do we believe only these interpretations? Because I was hearing about other interpretations of certain aspects of Scripture. And the response to that was one of, hey, this is what we believe, and this is the truth. And God would not make a mistake with the translations of the original text, and it's preserved divinely, and this is what we're about. I had a friend in that group who was having his own questioning and his own existential crisis, and eventually what that led to was that we essentially were the black sheep of the group now, and eventually the group disbanded. And when I had asked our community group, I was like, hey, was I the problem? Was I the reason why this group disbanded? Essentially, the answer was yes, because the people who wanted things to stay the same no longer felt safe in the group anymore with the questions we were bringing up and anything else. They said that the atmosphere did not feel light like it used to. Interestingly enough for me, to continue in that light atmosphere, the one that people wanted to return to, actually felt more suffocating. And so this is where we come to a crossroads with awakening. When you become more authentic to who you are, and as you discover that aspect, it puts you at a point of questioning, do I want to stay with things the way they are, because at least I'm still guaranteed a community and connection? Or do I want to go my own way that feels more aligned with my internal truth, but risk being alone? And as humans and being wired for connection, that's a terrifying choice, because we would love to have both integrated. We'd love to be part of a community where we can be our authentic selves, and even if people don't agree with us, we can still have dialogue. That doesn't happen in today's society. Here in the West, we are bifurcated into these tribes of thought, whether it's pertaining to race, politics, religion, gender, men, women, whatever it is. We are so attached to these groups and people who think like us and validate everything that we say, that the moment we come across somebody who has a different belief or different thought, even if they don't act on it, right? The whole pizza and pineapple, should it or should it not be on pizza, that sort of thing. Even in a silly example like that, you see how extreme people are on the ends, and how one group bashes the other and they bash the other group back. That leaves no one feeling happy. And especially when that applies to things of people's livelihood beyond just eating pizza, that is a recipe for depression, bitterness, and all sorts of other non-adaptive behaviors and living patterns. And that's what we're currently seeing in our modern day society. Everybody's afraid to talk to each other. Everybody's afraid to say what they actually think or believe for fear of judgment. And for all the words that we say about don't judge other people, look at the society we've created. Look at the environment we've created. It's all about judging. Now, with all of this, one question that you may be asking yourself is, well, what do I do? And my advice to that is to do your own internal work. Again, this goes back to what Dr. Shefali is talking about, is you need to be able to value awakening to your authentic self. And yes, that means there's a risk of being ostracized, criticized, and judged by other people. The way I proceeded with this was internal work. So what I did was look at the triggers, look at the areas where I was offended, and begin to integrate and heal that pain of looking at those wounds as wounded inner children and taking care of them. So another personal example of this is the topic of race. As you may have noticed, I am Asian, and living in America as an Asian person comes with certain benefits, and it also comes with certain detractions. Now, race is a huge topic in the political landscape in America, and the tone is either you're a white supremacist or you're somebody who advocates for people of color and down with white supremacy and white fascism. And I think both are on the extreme end, very dualistic and not integrating and being in the middle way. Now, I was on an extreme end of this, one of, I would call, victim consciousness, that there was a certain period in my life where I became very angry and upset with white people and anything related to whiteness. And that was a progression. So like I talked about earlier, how there's different states, I had moved from a state of apathy and depression, so I'm not good enough, as an Asian person, blah, 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 all the stereotypes that Asian men have ascribed to them, to one of anger. So now I was railing against all those stereotypes. And that's growth. That's improvement from where I was. But I was stuck there for a little bit. I was in this stage of blaming and pointing the fingers at others, how they have it better than I do, and that, poor me, somebody should take care of me. Somebody should value me, start looking at me. And it got to a point where I began to question if that was actually serving me. With all the complaining I was doing and still not seeing any results, I had to really be honest and look in the mirror and wonder, is this something I want to continue to do? And in the end, the answer was no. Because what I realized was, coming from that state of victim consciousness, I was centering my life, my happiness, my livelihood around comparison. That if white society, white structures, the whole system, whatever it is, cannot accept me, then I can never be happy. And then I had this interesting question to myself. I was like, why do I have to put it in the hands of other people to accept me in order to value myself? Right? And that comes from a more young, infantile state. And again, that's not to say it's right or wrong, and it's not to shame it. Because when you're an infant, you are in the most vulnerable stage in your life. You only have your parents to look to have that sense of love and acceptance. So there was that wound there of not feeling loved or accepted in areas of my life that had nothing to do with race. And so once I realized that, I was like, okay, I'm the one who needs to value myself because nobody else is going to do it. I can attempt to demand that the world accept and value me, so then I can accept and value myself. But that's a lot of people to convince, and that might never happen. So I began to do that work for myself. And as I learned to accept and love myself more, I had less instances of feeling offended or triggered by other people, even if they say racial slurs. Because it was like, hey, that's your problem, right? If you are able to say such things to other people, there's a good chance that you hate yourself. If you subscribe to the idea that we are all one and connected, then there's no way for you to treat me poorly that isn't a reflection of how you treat yourself poorly. So to me, it was a moment of letting it go and saying, hey, this person probably really hates themselves. They have a lot of self-loathing. And I can either become engaged in that, and so then we lock horns, and their self-hate is activated, my self-hate is activated. It's like, oh, that's not what I want to do. Because if I am triggered or offended in that way, then that's a signal for me to look at the areas where I am hateful and loathing towards myself, and to begin to love those parts, to bring healing to those parts. One other thing that I was thinking about when I watched Dr. Shefali's video, after that segment, I began to think, well, how do you know who's awake and who's asleep? Because to the person who is asleep, the person that is awake is the crazy one. And then same vice versa. To the person who is awake, the person who they perceive to be asleep is the crazy one. So how do you know who is who? And my answer is that perhaps it's the person who is not attached to any of it. Perhaps it's the person who does not mind other people and does not ascribe labels and does not attempt to convince or change other people, but simply lives his life simply. And that if somebody disagrees with him, he does not take it as a betrayal of their loyalty, but he simply says and does what he has to offer and lets other people make their conclusions. And I think the Buddha captured this in this quote that is supposedly ascribed to him. That's all for today's video. I hope you found something encouraging for you in your journey of awakening to your true self. In this day modern day social engineering, mainstream media, advertisements, music, entertainment, all telling us what thoughts to have, what beliefs to hold, how we should feel, how we should behave. May you know that you are independent of all of these things, that your inherent worth and value are beyond what others think of you, and if they approve of you or not. You know this truth when you go out into nature, when you see the sun rise, when you hear the birds sing, or when you're next to the peaceful and tranquil waters. You know this infinite peace. For nature simply is. Nature does not judge. And you too are the same source and energy of nature, cut from the same exact cloth. And so you too are this infinite love and peace. I leave you with this quote from Sufi poet Rumi, who writes that your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. For this is your birthright.